Yeah, the media are a business. Media conglomerates are a business. Journalism is not a business. Journalism is a calling. And that is the tradition of Indian journalism. You're witnessing the steady dismantling of judiciary and judicial power, which has been transferred to the executive, and even at very low levels. The genuine Western bias is that they think that the media in India is putting up a spirited fight. You know, and I know how exactly spirited is the fight put up by, by the major media groups of this country. The most famous quote in 1977 was that the press crawled when asked only to bend. Today, the press doesn't have to be asked to bend or crawl. It's there racing like hounds, snapping at the heels of anyone who is against the government.
We're going to talk about the freedom of press in India, the freedom of expression in India, or the lack of it. And I have a guest joining me right now, but first, let me give you some context to why this conversation is happening at this time. Now, you'll remember that some time ago, there was a report brought out by the Reporters Without Borders Association that basically does a check on freedom of expression across the world and gives a rating to different countries. India rated at 142, down from 133 that it was back in 2016. Now, this was not a great rating. Effectively, the organization said that India doesn't have very good freedom of expression. And we did a show on that. You can refer to it and you can take a look at a detailed report on that, on what the Reporters Without Borders said about India. The government of India was not pleased with that report. It largely said that this was a Western bias in understanding how India functions on the ground. And that by itself raised some eyebrows, because how can freedom of expression, which is a fundamental right, be different in different parts of the world? You either have the freedom or you don't. But what the government also did was set up a committee of its own. Now, what's interesting about this committee was that it has been set up, or it was set up, not just on instructions of the law ministry, but also on instructions of the External Affairs Ministry. So this was largely about, one could imagine, about India's image overseas, which is why the External Affairs Ministry was involved in the creating of this committee. Now, the committee was called the Index Monitoring Cell, or the IMC. The IMC then put out its report, and there were two journalists on this, included on this panel. One was Mr. P. Sainath, the other one was Mr. Rajat Sharma. The committee put out a report, or so the press thought. The committee had this draft report, and it basically echoed the government sentiment, saying that the West has misunderstood what freedom of expression is like in India. Things are not really that bad. It did, of course, list some concerns. It talked about concentrated media ownership without really getting into any of the problems. It talked about limited powers of regulators, or self, sort of regulation committees. It talked about criminal defamation, financial security of journalists, and specifically the state of journalists in Jammu and Kashmir. But it was really, as a journalist myself, I can tell you, a very, very weak report. And that should by itself have been worrying. Post that, one of the members of this committee, Mr. P. Sainath, put out his statement, or what can be viewed at least as a dissenting report, because apparently he had written a response to that report that was neither included nor made public. He made it public himself. Now, this very extensive report, in his dissent, he basically talks about the fact that there are gaping holes in the report that the government's committee has put out. He talks about the fact that the basic right to dissent for journalists against government, for journalists against the organizations that they work for, the FIRs, the legal action, the sedition, the shutting down of the internet that the government and various agencies of government have taken part in the last couple of years, show us that things aren't as bad as what the Reporters Without Borders have said. They're actually, and I quote, much, much worse on the ground. And the situation in the ground is in fact getting worse, according to Mr. Sainath's report. He also talks about retrenchment, the number of journalists who've lost their jobs, the attack on journalists, the internet shutdowns, the false cases that have been filed. And he lists out a great number of those false cases. 22 arrests of journalists, 9 notices against journalists, 23 FIRs, 21 freedom of expression related cases, cases filed against people who are not journalists. Like we saw cartoonists, comedians having to show up in court, having to, being arrested, things like that. Those all have a bearing on freedom of speech and expression, which, let me remind you, is a fundamental right in our country. So it's not just about journalists, it's about each and every one of us. Now, it took us some time to work through all of the documents and to get time with the Sainath, but he's here today. And I just want to put this in context for you as audience members. You know, when you sit down to just quickly type a WhatsApp message to somebody you know, and you think for a second, should I put this on WhatsApp? What if it leaks? What if at some point someone reads this? What if at some point this is held against me? That question in your mind is an indication that you don't have freedom of speech. If you think 10 times before writing something on social media or sharing something on social media, just the fact that you have to think that is an indication that you don't have freedom of expression in its purest form. That's the conversation that we're going to have today. P. Sainath, thank you so much for joining me this evening and giving me your time. And I also break this down piece by piece. The formation of this committee by government order, you were invited, you accepted to be part of this committee. Why did the government decide to form the committee? And what were its purposes when it started off, according to you?
It's very clear that this government and previous governments in India also it's not unique to this government. They are incredibly more sensitive to their image in the Western media than they are to how they look in the eyes of their own people or media. And the problem of how they look in their own media has largely been solved since the biggest sections of the media have reduced themselves to cheerleaders for government. So really it upsets them when what you can call white man's media gives them a poor rating. Now, please understand how many poor ratings there have been. In the Reporters Sans Frontiers World Press Freedom Index, you were actually 106 in 2009. Now you're 142. You have the Freedom House in the United States downgrading in its listing India from free to partly free. You have the We Dem, the democracy, We Dem Institute in Sweden, declaring you to be an elected autocracy. And this really upsets them. It upsets them so much that the instruction to form this committee, primarily seeking to a way to rebut the Reporters Sans Frontiers report, comes, but you're right, Faye, you're right in saying that the law ministry, external affairs ministry, they had people on the committee, but I mean, they had people on the committee, but the actual instruction did not come from the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. It came from the Union Cabinet Secretary. Now, the Union Cabinet Secretary doesn't take his orders from too many people in the country. He won't have time for half or 60% of the cabinet. Okay, so it's very obvious that the need to form this committee was felt at the highest levels of government in India. You don't get the Union Cabinet Secretary writing off to say form a committee. Now so it's clear that they took it so seriously, so importantly. Another idea of how they took it so seriously, and I really find that entertaining, is that in their negotiation or to discuss this with Reporters Sans Frontiers. Reporters Sans Frontiers is a body of distinguished journalists. It's a non-profit. It's not a government or a gigantic structure. The person the Indian government directed to speak to the Reporters Sans Frontiers is India's ambassador to France.
Yes.
Hold on, man. I mean, that guy's got a minister rank or something like that. Okay. Now you're so upset. You're so mad that you're asking the ambassador to France to take charge of, explaining our position to them. Our position meaning the position of the government of India. And the third thing is, see, when in the light of why does this report, so that's why this council committee was so important to government. And why the so-called leak, there was never any, why that is important to government and why they are now pretending this committee doesn't exist. And I haven't heard from the committee in 3 months, except one line from an assistant director general of the PIB, Press Information Bureau, who's not a member, but part of that supporting team or whatever, saying, sorry, I was away on leave. Now, months have passed without any activity on the committee front. Now, for them, at a time when they are counter-attacking Freedom House, WeDem, Reporters Sans Frontières with Western bias, then it's extremely embarrassing, I guess, if a committee set up by the highest levels of government in India then produces an independent note saying things are much worse than what these guys say.
Yeah.
How do you dismiss that as Western bias? And by the way, the first constitution of the committee had 2 journalists on an issue of media freedom, press freedom, freedom of expression. It had 2 journalists, one of whom did not really participate. So then they added 2 more. But the committee as constituted had 11 government employees and 2 journalists to discuss state of media freedom and press freedom. 11 out of 13 are government employees. So that is a bit weird.
So you believe, and you've said so as well, that this was entirely a PR exercise just to basically whitewash what the foreign press was saying about India at the time?
Well, yes, but you can't go publicly and appoint a committee on that ground alone, right? So you create other agendas which make it possible for people like me to be seen on the committee, with the committee. In fact, if you look at the acknowledgements, the first page of the committee, the first acknowledgement profusely is gratitude to yours truly. Now, this is hilarious, and now they're not saying a word. They created a huge methodology. One of our appendix documents is an analysis of the methodology used, and they ended up doing some really funny things, hilarious things. Now, the RSF document, as I understand, it's a survey done of 12 journalists, Indian and foreign, kept anonymous for obvious reasons, and they surveyed them across a large number of parameters. So our guys, see, our committee had these 13 members and 4 full meetings of the full committee, and then there were subgroups, of which I was not a part. I don't believe any journalist was part of any of the subgroups. One of these subgroups undertook the exercise of repeating the survey with the exact same questionnaire as the Western biased RSF had and seeing what would be the outcome of that. And they took 50% more, 18 journalists instead of 12. Now, a survey by definition has to have a proper sample, a spread, everything. All 18 journalists were from a single class, in a single course, in a single institute called the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, the Development Journalism Mid-Career course. There were 8 Indian journalists and 10 foreign journalists. And that entire course, by the way, is funded and run under the aegis of the External Affairs Ministry. Now, where have you heard of a survey of journalists from one course in a mass comm school? And it brought out some brilliant results. They said, see, the RSF said this. We used their questionnaire, and this is what comes out. It says the first finding of your survey is, the first survey of our unbiased, non-Western Indian surveyors is the overwhelming majority of the respondents said there was total freedom of press in India. The media enjoyed total freedom in India. Conversely, a majority, that is 62.5%. Conversely, 60%, a majority of 60% said there was very little media freedom in other countries. And it goes on like this. So they're trying to show you that RSF got it wrong. Their methodology or interpretation was wrong. They've used their same questionnaire and come with, totally different results.
So just to put it in a nutshell, the government effectively, according to you, put together a PR exercise that would simply, with its only purpose was to rebut what the Reporters Without Borders had said in their rating. But I want to, if I may, Sainath, focus on your dissenting report and what you have said about freedom of expression, because that's really something that I would like the audience to hear. You basically said that things are a lot worse on the ground than even the international agencies seem to think. And you've talked about many things, about concerns that you have, and the fundamental concern is the right to dissent. You say journalists in India do not have the right to dissent, either with the government or with the organizations that employ them or with anyone else. Why do you believe that to be true?
They have the right to dissent in the constitution they live under. But that is increasingly being snuffed out. The kind of see, also this whole process is to be located in the larger political processes that are unfolding around us. There are three huge things happening. And the right to legal redress is being steadily removed from every law that is being brought in. We discussed this, Faye, when we read out, and you put out for your audience the clauses from the farm laws, yes, which barred the jurisdiction of the courts, yes, and removed local. Now, do you know, since we had that discussion, they have also included that clause in other laws and gone further. Karnataka, in the Karnataka law on cow slaughter that was brought in by an ordinance, pushed through by the governor, and it's there. To all those clauses of barring jurisdiction and all those clauses about any other persons acting under this law in good faith, they have added one more, that those other persons acting under this law will be deemed to be public servants. Yes. So you've written a law for vigilantes. I come and loot and arson and commit arson at your house and say, I caught her with beef. Yeah. My lawyer can argue a case in court that I'm deemed as a public servant. I took a public spirited action there. So that is critical. So one part is you're witnessing the steady dismantling of judiciary and judicial power, which is being transferred to the executive, even at very low levels. Low-level executive are getting the powers that district-level courts and judges had. That's one. The second is that from 1977, civil society organizations, non-profits, people's movements, correctly geared themselves towards how to withstand state pressure, state repression, state whatever. But nobody envisaged a situation where the state can outsource terror, where the state can outsource intimidation. The government doesn't do it. It's not the state or the government that led the attack on Muhammad Aflaq's house. So what happens when the state has major ties with powerful non-state actors? So look, I don't believe that anyone in government had anything to do with the assassination of Gauri Lankesh or Kalburgi, Professor Kalburgi, or Govind Pansare. I don't believe that any secret government, I think that's madness to even suggest that. But there were non-state actors whose aims, whose politics are very clearly discernible in the three killings. So I'm saying that this, and then the third actor is corporate power. The government of India does not have to bring the press to heel. In fact, one of the things about Western bias is that the genuine Western bias is that they think that the media in India is putting up a spirited fight. You know, and I know how exactly spirited is the fight put up by, you know, by the major media groups of this country. They are vying with each other, competing with each other to please the government of India. Just look at going back to the cases of tweets and arrests. For me, one of the pick of this lot is the arrest of Zubair Ahmed in the Andamans. Okay, for a tweet asking, "Can someone explain to me why a family is placed in quarantine for speaking on the phone to a COVID patient?" This was his tweet. Okay, a family was placed under quarantine for speaking. So when he put out this tweet, he was arrested. Though, by the way, the previous day, a local newspaper, not run by a Muslim, had pretty much said the same thing. He was arrested. Now, Samuel Raj Pandian in Coimbatore, what was he arrested for? What was he arrested under? One of the things we learned on this committee, which was one of the useful things to come out of ourselves, they were useful things, was that there are 52 laws that affect the media in this country. For heaven's sake, how do you go out and report anything? Samuel Raj Pandian was arrested under the Epidemic Diseases Act. The last famous person to be arrested under the Epidemic Diseases Act was Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Okay, now that is really seriously a problem. When you are pulling out laws out of colonial mothballs and using them to arrest journalists. Now you look at, and then again the use by police, by state agencies, they use non-state ordinary citizens or trolls to file their cases. The case against Supriya Sharma of Scroll.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, filed in Varanasi, the Prime Minister's constituency, which, by the way, has seen a number of threats and punishments to journalists over there, because it's the Prime Minister's constituency. You can't say anything is going bad. Jana Sandesh, they got the a warning. The case filed against Supriya, the FIR was filed by someone who was described in the FIR as a casual contract laborer with the local municipal council. Now, when NDTV asked the family, "How did you come to know of this article written in an English website, which you are unlike?" They said very sweetly and honestly, "हाँ, ये हवलदार ने बताया हमको. Our local policeman told us to file the case." Now, they've said that. So it is actually, I think you're looking at a situation that, would make Kafka envious.
I do want to ask you this, and this comes up, and now I'm diverting away from, the initial topic that we started off with. This comes up, in fact, with a lot of people that I speak to. There is a fundamental argument that as soon as the owners of media attempt to make it a business, where they're looking at numbers, they're looking at readership, they're looking at viewership, they want to bring in advertising money. If they don't, they start, the retrenchment begins, which you've also written about. Journalists lose their jobs. The teams are very thin. There's no room to do research. There's no room to do any real work. You're just feeding the monster on a daily basis. Where is the solution to journalism that is also meant to be a business? Because the other option is the BBC that is owned by a government, which is also not an ideal solution. So is journalism meant to be a social service, in which case are journalists meant to starve and their children meant to go to government schools? Is it meant to be a successful, viable, capitalist business? How should this really work in today's modern era? How would this work?
Okay, but I'm saying I question the juxtaposition of doing good journalism with having to starve. Okay, I have no intention of starving. But I do intend to do a lot of good journalism, and so do you. Okay, neither of us has any intention of stopping. I think that the media were doomed in many. See, I don't believe the media were ever meant to be big business in that sense. But in a capitalist setup, everything becomes a business. Everything is commodified. Everything. Now, I will say, in fact, Mr. Samir Jain said it in the 80s that journalism is a business like any other business. Now, he said media are a business like any other business. Now, my point is this. Yeah, the media are a business. Media conglomerates are a business. Newspapers, channels, chain conglomerates, these are a business. A television studio is a business. Journalism is not a business. Journalism is a calling. And that is the tradition of Indian journalism. Again, you look at the tradition. All your great media agencies in Europe, how did they start? They did not start about freedom of information or expression. That is stupid. Reuters, Havas, Wolf, Agence France-Presse, they started as purveyors of commercial intelligence to the city's exchanges. Reuters began, and not many people understand this or know this. Reuters began with Baron von Reuter having a staff of 200 pigeons. 200 pigeons, homing pigeons. So what did he use those pigeons for? Do you know, in those days, it took days and days for a ship to cross the Atlantic, right? Now, you didn't know what the ships were that were coming in. What were those ships coming in from USA to Europe carrying? Yeah, were they carrying gold? Were they carrying corned beef? Were they carrying maize? What were they carrying? Now, the fate of the market and speculation in the market of London depended on knowing what that was there. Mr. Baron Reuter bought off the captains of the ships and stationed homing pigeons with them. When they were closer home, they would release the pigeon with a ringlet saying beef, corn, maize, whatever. He then worked this into a new service for the subscribers from the Dalal Street of London. Okay, yes. And that's how AP on the other side of the Atlantic, the agencies there in the US, they employed small, fast boats to go out and meet the ship, figure out what was happening, come back, resell. So then the market of the New York Stock Exchange knew what to bet on, what to put their money in. In our countries, the press started. Next year, a few months from now, we're going to have the 200th anniversary of the real Indian press. You know, when you went to journalism school, you heard all this crap about Hickey's Gazette 17, whatever. That was neither Indian nor was it journalism. Yes. Speculating on who the Governor General's wife was playing around with. That kind of misogynistic crap wasn't journalism, and it wasn't India. In a few months from now, we will have the 200th anniversary of Raja Ram Mohan Roy's founding of Miratul Akhbar. By the way, yeah. The newspaper not in Bengali, but in Persian, which was the language of the elite at that time, the language of the Mughal court, all these things. So here you are, from day one, the Indian journalist, the great tradition. We have little traditions. The great traditions, the Raja Ram Mohan Roy, from day one, he is concerned with infanticide, with education of girls, with widow remarriage. This is what he stands for. That was the journalism that he unleashed. It was a journalistic tradition today, because corporations get to define who are journalists, who is a professional. You're not a professional. You know, you're an ideologue and an activist. Okay. You know, who else were those ideologues and activists? The greatest, most prolific journalists of this country ever were Gandhi and Ambedkar. Please show me how many of us have written 50 volumes of collected works. These are, each of them started 3 newspapers. Each of them started 3 journals, whether it was Ambedkar or Gandhi. And their journalism was in that great tradition from Royce of social issues, untouchability, colonialism, human rights. These were the issues of Indian journalism. Out of 200 years, we have for about 160 a very distinguished history. And yes, you're right, it was never profitable. Yeah, it was never profitable. But that's why, by the way, a journalist was also a generalist. Very often, journalists did other things to keep the fire burning, or they had to do many other things to do it. Yeah. So that is the history of journalism. It was not meant to be a commercial enterprise, but you can have, look, the finest English newspaper in the world, with all my differences with it, is trust owned. It is not owned by a corporation. I'm talking of the Guardian UK. I have serious problems with the politics of the Guardian, but there is no denying that it is the finest large English daily in the world. Yeah. Now, the Guardian is not owned by a corporation.
Yeah.
So there are other forms of ownership, other forms of, now, what happened, the big transition in India, pre-freedom and say from the 60s, 70s onwards, there was that diversity. There was an unmatched diversity and pluralism in India as in the United States in the 19th century. Again, within the limited white spectrum. Here, anybody who had 5 rupees and a vision could start a newspaper, as indeed the original founders of the Hindu did. They had 5 rupees, they borrowed 5 rupees, they raised 25 rupees. Today, you'd probably pay that much for 3 copies of the Sunday Hindu.
Yes.
Now, corporatization meant that all individuals, idealism was say, priced out of the market. It was priced out of the market. You did something, the bottom line became the bottom line. So that
and also you cannot, and I just want to at this point draw, you did mention that those of us, you said, who've lived through the emergency. Now, we've heard stories about the fact that during the emergency, newspapers printed blank columns on the front page to show that the government had censored, and they wouldn't stand for that censorship, and their audience should had the right to know that there was a story here that has been removed. Today, it's made amply clear by these news organizations that you are going to cost us business, you are going to cost your colleagues their jobs, you are going to cost us advertising, you are going to cost us the guest list of our next conclave, because you insist on doing these stories. So we cannot be a business that upsets the establishment. There is a sea change in the way corporate media functions today and the way it did back in the emergency in the 70s, isn't it?
Well, I think that you need a little corrective on the emergency. Barring in the big newspapers, barring the Indian Express, nobody else did this blank editorial stuff.
Okay.
The Times, at the end of the emergency, Bennett, Coleman, and co. Always, in my old place where I worked in Kawasji Patel Street in Blitz, we always affectionately called them Bandit, Conman, and co. And at the end of the emergency, they had to print an apology. They went for an editorial apologizing for what they did. Today they would. Mr. Girilal Jain himself, they supported that emergency to a T. Okay. Hindustan Times victimized B.G. Verghese, who was editor of that paper, threw him out, got him out, and got a Sanjay Gandhi kind of, a bunch of people appointed to posts who had the approval of Sanjay Gandhi. So let's not romanticize. Thousands of journalists resisted the emergency from small publications, non-corporate publications. The big difference between pre-60s and post-90s is that many more newspapers were family-owned, individual-owned. They were not corporate. Okay, they were not corporate. Now, look, small publications like Seminar. Small publications like Mainstream, these were shut down during the emergency. Journalists of a large number of Indian language publications were out of jobs, went to jail. Okay. And so it isn't such a great, it's like how the American press tries to rewrite its history in Watergate. After Watergate broke and the story peaked, he got a 73% amendment. You have to make a difference between media and the journalist, between owner and journalist. All the newspapers compromised in terms of taking certain big editors off the line if Mr. Sanjay Gandhi didn't like them. Today that happens. A big difference. At that time, the most famous quote in 1977 was that the press crawled when asked only to bend. Mr. Advani used to repeat this when he was INB minister, and it is attributed to him, though it wasn't actually his statement, but it was a very correct one, that the press crawled when today the press doesn't have to be asked to bend or crawl. It doesn't have to be brought to heel. It's there racing like hounds, snapping at the heels of anyone who is against the government. So they're coming at it from many fronts. On the other hand, they're coming at it through campaigns of character assassination, vilification of the journalist, dedicated trolls. I don't know how many you have, but I fancy it's quite a tribe. And my Wikipedia page has become an indoor sport. Yeah, the number of times it's been trashed and the way I've been vilified on it. So you're going to see a lot of this. Now, what happens here is that you might prove yourself innocent in court, as you very likely will. But the mud sticks. Some mud sticks. Wasn't she a money launderer? Wasn't she? So that is going to be one. Character assassination from the non-state actors is the second. And then while the charges are on, suddenly, like they did with Amnesty International India, freeze the accounts. Now for 6 months, 8 months, the accounts are frozen. When that organization reopens, it's broke. Now for independent media organizations, that is a death sentence. How will they pay their employees in those 6 months, 8 months, whatever the accounts are? So this is going to be the direction. So I'm saying we need a law of false arrest. Punishment.
So you're saying that if you look at the entire landscape right now, traditional, and I like to call it traditional media, which is newspapers, magazines, and television, journalism, I'm using the word journalism broadly here, journalism is owned largely by a handful of companies that have decided that cheering for, encouraging, and running with the government is what their job is. The true dissent is really coming from independent journalists and independent organizations that are mushrooming across the country.
And from independent-minded journalists within the corporate media as well.
Yes.
Those who have paid the price,
who have paid the price. And those people are likely to now be, I mean, if you just look at the landscape, are likely to be crushed by what you're saying, excessive police action, investigation from various agencies, FIRs that are lodged, the misuse of sedition, misuse of UAPA, all of these other very creatively designed laws that our government has. And let's not forget vigilantes, trolls on the internet, people who abuse, who give threats, who threaten and scare individuals. So all of this is meant,
and to hack your computers and to hack your social media handles.
So all of this is meant to silence journalists, or is it meant to change the fabric of journalism as we know it in our country? And is it successful?
I think that to this point, they've been rather successful. But I want to say one thing: what the corporate media do, you do have good journalists. You and I know that there are some fabulous journalists working in the Times Group, in Express, and elsewhere. But what the media tend to do, what they've done, what corporatization of media does, it reduces journalism to one more revenue stream. So journalism has to justify its existence by its contribution to revenue. There may be exceptions. Sometimes when you don't have a choice, you have to cover something. You can't but cover some degree the migrations. I mean, no newspaper could have escaped covering the mass migrations out. By the way, they're beginning again on a different scale.
Yes.
So what corporatization does is that it reduces journalism to another revenue stream. Now, when you're a very large conglomerate, you have too many interests. You have an incredible number of interests. Like as you pointed out with the farm laws, one of the biggest beneficiaries of those laws will be Mr. Ambani. He is the biggest owner of media, and those media he does not own, he is the biggest advertiser very often. So there is a glaring conflict of interest there, but who cares? You can shout it out, but he's got the guns, he's got the media. So that's one thing. What happens now, again, I'm telling you, don't delink it from the larger political process. Exactly the same. Now, it was, in one sense, the Disha Ravi case did everybody a favor in that, it did everybody a favor in that it was so ridiculous that you had to be absolutely a complete, you had to be delusional or find some other word stronger than total moron.
And there were some.
Yeah, there were quite a few. So that's one thing. Corporate profit is one, but also understand that within those corporate leadership and owners, there are also those who believe, who are believers in that politics. I want to say a few words about the police accountability law. Now, you look at in most democracies, maybe that's a Western bias, there is some law of compensation, of corrective, something, maybe not easy to access, but where someone who knowingly forces a false case on you is liable to some punishment. We have no such law. None of those policemen responsible around the Hathras case in UP is going to get anything but a delayed promotion.
Yes.
They will get a punishment transfer for 6 months, and then they will be rehabilitated and promoted as people who have.
We hope. Yeah. Delayed promotion, we hope. That may not even be the case for all we know.
And it will certainly be out of turn promotion. They will be, okay. So I'm saying that you cannot fight this on the ground unless there is a strong disincentive that those who frame false cases on people must do jail time. Now, I sought the help of senior lawyers, including Prashant Bhushan and his friends, who were very helpful in putting together that, helping to shape that draft law, where if I frame you and you would have to serve, say, 4 years imprisonment on that charge, and it's proved that I have done this knowingly and wantonly, then I must be liable to an equal amount of jail time. If I have done it out of stupidity or out of negligence, gross negligence, then half that jail time. I'm saying that the cops going out there should know this, that they will take.
Won't that so then lead to a reluctance on the part of the police to file FIRs at all, working of cases, which we know is already a problem among our police?
I don't think there is ever going to be a lack of enthusiasm of the police to file cases on people at the behest of the government. It is that they will be a lot more careful in what they do. It will actually make them file better cases, file genuine cases. Look at it that way. They're going to have to get it right. And
do you want this to be at the FIR stage or at the charge sheet stage?
Open to discussion. I'm saying that if it leads to false imprisonment, or if it leads to a situation where your name and where you have spent time in jail, whatever time in jail, then you have to, that is what has to be punished first. And
could it also be interpreted as the responsibility of the district magistrates who deny bail for several weeks? It's only when cases wind up in High Court and in some cases in Supreme Court where bail is actually granted. So is the responsibility on the police officer who has filed the FIR, or is the responsibility on the district magistrate who has denied the bail?
You know, actually, I've seen a large number of district courts which give bail for anything.
Okay.
You know, one of the stories the only story that the Times of India did not use of mine, and I sympathized with them, was a story I did of somewhere in the eastern sector, sitting in a court, in a local court, and watching a magistrate grant bail to 72 people in 1 hour for cases which in a high court would never have got bail. Okay, so granting and not granting of bail, yeah, bail is the rule, jail is the exception, correct. But I'm saying granting of bail happens. It is very selective. Who gets it? Who gets bail? Who gets their cases heard by the Supreme Court? Who is asked to go back to the lowest court? All this is very selective, and it's part of that dismantling of judicial power.
Okay.
Part of that. I told you those three things: federalism, dismantling of judicial power, the rise of corporate power, and an alliance between these three. So that is actually posing serious threats to our all the freedoms, not just of, again, I said it about the farm laws, I say it again, it was never just about farms.
Yes. All right, I have completely run out of time and overshot the time that we had agreed to talk about, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I do hope our audience also benefits greatly from this conversation. Leave us suggestions at the bottom of this video on things you'd like us to talk about, and we'll try and convince Sainath to come back and have more conversations with us. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Thank you.